In Mark chapter 1 that was read a moment ago, a leper comes to Jesus and says, "If you choose, you can make me clean." And Jesus' response to that was, "I choose. You are clean." Sticks and stones can break your bones, but words can never harm you. I don't know who wrote that little rhyme that was used by my parents and teachers in my childhood to stall and stymie my tattletaling on friends who called me names, but whoever wrote the rhyme was dead wrong. Do you know how easy it is for a label to stick? You know how easy it is to nickname a person or label a person or place an identity on a person? And do you know how quickly it sticks and how powerful it can be in shaping someone's life? Kenneth sat beside me in first grade. He talked a lot, and I mean he talked a lot. Miss Hicks, our teacher, was one of the most gracious ladies that I have ever met in my life. But one day, Miss Hicks had heard all that she could take, and she turned around and she said, "Kenneth, you chirp nonstop. You chirp nonstop. I'm going to have to call you Cricket. I'm going to call you Cricket from now on because you just chirp nonstop." I want you to know who was called Cricket all the way through 12th grade in our school. In fact, Kenneth wasn't called Kenneth again until he went to college and told everyone his name was Kenneth, people that didn't know him. And Facebook was the worst thing that ever happened to him when all of his old friends from elementary school were united. Cricket. That's fairly harmless, but that's not always the case. Before we decided to be tough on crime years ago, we actually offered Pell Grants and college classes to state and federal prisoners so that they might be educated and rehabilitated while in prison. Now we just sentence people and let them watch TV and lift weights for years until they are released, and then we gripe about the fact that many of them return. That's another sermon for another day, okay? But during the days when Pell Grants were offered and college educations were accessible in the state and federal prison systems, I was teaching in the high security prison, federal prison in Jessup, Georgia for Bruton Parker College. It was a high security prison. I stood behind a podium to teach. There was a window cut into the wall behind me where a guard stood with a rifle to watch over the class. I wore a body alarm that I could hit with my arm just in case things got out of hand. I was welcoming a new class on this particular day. I was learning their names and, of course, their nicknames because nobody goes by their name in federal high security prison. And as they were going around sharing their names and the origin of their nicknames, one gentleman at the back of the second row, I will never forget him, said, "My name is Zero." I said, "Zero? Well, how did you get to be called Zero? Who tagged you Zero in here?" And he said, "Oh, it wasn't anybody in here. It was my old man in the third grade." He said, "I didn't turn in my homework one day." He said, got busy playing outside, and when I brought home my homework grade for the day, my dad looked at it half drunk and said, "Zero, boy, you ain't going to count to nothing for the rest of your life. I'm just going to call you Zero." And he called me Zero, and everybody called me Zero, and everybody's called me Zero since then, as he introduced himself from the last seat in the back of the second row in a high security federal prison. I don't know who wrote that little rhyme about sticks and stones, but they were dead wrong. You place an identity on a person, and it takes no time for it to stick and begin shaping a life. Now, Jesus knew this. Jesus knew this. And so you remember Peter, the disciple named Peter? That wasn't his original name, right? What was his first name? What was his original name? Simon. That's right. He was called Simon, and Simon in Greek means flighty bird, one that's indecisive. It's like a bird that jumps from one branch to the next and can't decide exactly where the bird wants to land. That's what the word Simon means. This was Simon. "Lord, I believe I can walk on water." "No, I don't think I can walk on water." "Lord, I will never deny you, even if they kill me." He denied Jesus 3 times. This was Simon. He was flighty, back and forth, couldn't land. And Jesus looked at him and said, "You know what? I'm not going to call you Simon anymore. I'm going to call you Peter, rock." Jesus knew. You place an identity on a person, and it takes no time for it to stick and shape a life. And so in Mark chapter 1, a leper comes to Jesus and says, "If you choose, you can make me clean." And what Jesus says is, "I choose, you are clean." You have a new label. You have a new identity. Do you know that just by speaking, you can change the direction of a person's life? Just by moving past whatever label has been put on a person, you can offer a new life, a new status, a new future, just by calling them something different. I have a new book that came out a couple of weeks ago. You all probably did not know about that. They're for sale at the front desk for $10. I'll be signing in the fellowship hall today from 4 o'clock to 6 o'clock. This past week, I was on a little mini tour in the California Bay Area with the book. I had been invited to be the speaker at the Dog-Eared Bookstore. It's in the Castro. The Castro is the neighborhood of San Francisco. I was speaking and had just gotten into the little speaking engagement time when I saw a young lady walk in the door of the bookstore. She made her way around the crowd and stood at the back of the crowd over on my left side. Afterwards, I saw her kind of wandering and walking and lingering and hovering, and you can always tell after a worship service or after any time when people are gathered when somebody wants to talk to you. And so I finally made my way over to her. She looked like she was in her late 20s. I said, did you need to talk to me? And she said, "Yeah, do you mind?" I said, "Oh, no, absolutely not." She told me her story. She said, "I grew up in a very conservative, fundamentalist church in Oklahoma." She said, "I have known since I was in high school that I was gay." She said, "I used to go down to the altar at my church and pray and pray and pray that God would change me. I didn't tell anybody, but I wanted God to change me." She said, "I even signed up after college for a 2-year stint on the mission field, hoping that if I gave my life to God, God would change me. And I went on the mission field and even met a young man on the mission field and married that young man thinking God was going to change me." And she said, "After the 2-year stint, we came home on furlough, and I had to admit to my husband, and I had to admit to my family, and had to admit to my church who I was. And when I did," she said, "my husband left me as I expected, but my family took me to church, and I had to stand in front of my congregation while they disfellowshipped me and told me that I could not be Christian and could not be a member of the church until I changed." She said, "Having nowhere else to go, I flew into San Francisco 2 days ago. And I wandered down here tonight to get something to eat and thought I'd slip into a bookstore. And I heard you, and you said you were a preacher?" I said, "Yes." And she said, "And you're talking about this book." And she said, "Did I hear you right? Did you use the phrase," this is her word, she said, "did you use the phrase, 'my LGBTQ brothers and sisters'?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Did you call me your sister?" I said, "I did." And I gave her a book. Gave her a book. That's a miracle in and of itself because they're $10 a piece. But the real miracle is, with just a word, you can reshape a person's life. I don't know who wrote that poem. They were dead wrong. I am honored to welcome to the pulpit today Katrice Hardy. I met Katrice in the middle of a discussion on diversity. The conversation had gotten a bit convoluted, to say the least. She raised her hand to speak, and in one short spoken paragraph, she assessed all the logic in the room, summarized it, stated it with clarity, and then said, do you remember this? "I'm a journalist. It's what I do." And she's a real journalist. And that's a sermon for another day. She is the executive editor of the Greenville News. She is the Southeast Regional Editor of USA Today. Her husband Carlos and her daughter Gianni are with her today. But most of all, she is a person who knows the power of words. And I've asked her to come and share her words with us this morning.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here today. Today's service, filled with brave young children who are learning to serve God and others, reminds me so much of my own childhood. I grew up in Louisiana, in a small city in West Baton Rouge Parish, and my family, just about all of my family, went to a small country church called St. Mark Baptist Church. It was a kind of place where if you weren't related, you felt like you were. It was also the kind of church where if a child by the time they had turned 3 hadn't at least attempted to participate in a church program, then our longtime pastor and his wife was calling somebody's house to find out why. You see, I grew up saying the welcome and singing and performing in church plays from a very young age. When I was in middle school, I was occasionally the guest speaker for youth programs. Now I have to admit, back then, I didn't always like that. But looking back today, those experiences taught me so much. Confidence, public speaking skills, a love and understanding for the Bible. I learned compassion for others, and mostly that with hard work and dedication, you could accomplish or become anything. That foundation, I'm certain, prompted me to love reading and storytelling. And by the time I was in middle school, I also knew what I wanted to be. And for those of you who are older in the congregation, I wanted to be like Dan Rather. My desire to be a journalist over the years only grew stronger despite the naysayers. You see, there weren't a lot of journalists back then on television or even in newspapers who looked like me. And when I went to K through 12th school at an LSU laboratory school, it was a parochial school actually on LSU's campus, where there may have been 24 students who looked like me on the entire campus. That wasn't a popular thing to say. When I would turn in my class assignments into TV newscasts or speak with passion about wanting to be a journalist, some of those kids chuckled, and a few of those teachers asked me, pulled me aside and said, please consider a backup plan. My parents, though, they always told me I could do anything as long as I worked hard and, more importantly, treated others the way I wanted to be treated. They implored me to get a good education and taught me through hard work and sacrifice most things were possible, no matter what your race was or your humble beginnings. I'd say they were right. Today I am a journalist. I get to work every day with 70 journalists who actually work in 4 newspapers, 2 in South Carolina, 1 in North Carolina, and 1 in Virginia. And we come to work every day hoping to make a difference. I and most of the other editors daily ask ourselves, what are the most important stories that we can explore that are affecting the communities we live in and serve? How can we lend education to an issue that's perplexing or confusing to our readers? How can we provide a voice for those who are underserved and most often are the voiceless? And more importantly, how can we help facilitate understanding among our communities to the plight of the unfortunate or those who are just different, those who need someone to listen to them? And how can we help unite communities and help mend fences? Jim asked me today to make sure that I explored how we can imagine and work together for a better present and future. It's an interesting question and one that I thought a lot about since we talked. If I had to answer that question truthfully from my gut the first time we talked about it, I would have to be honest and tell you that it won't be easy. Here's why. When I became editor of the Greenville News and Southeast Regional Editor for USA Today Network, there was only one other African-American female at that time who was the editor of another daily metro in the United States. Now, I'm not talking about the year 1990 or even 2000. That was in 2016, less than 2 years ago. When I think about how the media is generally viewed these days as a group of people with an agenda or an axe to grind, who are spineless and intent on spreading false information, I am also disheartened because I know that couldn't be farther from the truth. And when I think about the discontent we still face from some who don't view people who look like me as equals with similar goals and who aren't willing to listen but are intent on spreading hate, I again am sad and disheartened. Aren't some of you? But then as I kept wrestling with Jim's question, clarity and hope, it eventually emerged. I thought about my childhood, a little girl growing up in a small town with two parents who did nothing but work hard to help me thrive and grow. I thought about me and so many other children in my town who went to church every Sunday with a church full of people who loved us and looked out for us and who without hesitation taught us right from wrong. I think about how they demanded that even a 3-year-old, whether their parents had to hold them on the stage or not, would get up and attempt to say welcome to the parishioners that day. Then I think about the editor of my hometown newspaper, who taught me my first journalism class as an LSU freshman. He encouraged me to apply for a news aide job at my hometown newspaper. He didn't look like me. He really didn't know me, but he knew my work ethic. He knew my potential. It was a start to a career where I never imagined that one day I would be serving you in the wonderful community of Greenville. But here we are. So I say to each and every one of you today, imagine every child in here building upon what each of you have taught them and going out in the world and becoming doctors or artists or whatever they want to be. But then imagine them and each and every one of you spending time with someone who isn't like you, listening to them and learning, for example, that maybe the secretary who you talk to every morning actually desires to be a lawyer, and maybe you give her a shot at some assignment that maybe eventually opens the door for her to one day become a lawyer. From my seat as a journalist, as a mom, as a resident living in a thriving, growing community, what wonderful stories those would be. Can you imagine? You see, someone did that for me. That editor at The Advocate who encouraged me to apply for that news aide job at my first paper in my freshman year of college. Jim Dant did that for me when he asked me to share my story and my vision with you today. You did that by simply being willing to listen. So I'll end by asking each and every one of you, what will you do? Think about all the children who spoke today and took on leadership roles. What a wonderful present and future world they'll live in if we all do something. Help someone who is unlike us in some way. Listen to a neighbor who you know nothing about, or try to connect with someone to truly understand their story. Just someone who's not like you. Can you imagine? Thank you.